Russia. Isn't it such a beautiful place to live in? I don't think so. Especially during the early 1900s. I'm sure you are all aware that Russia was going through some pretty rough times. The countryside was stagnant, factories had nightmarish working conditions, sanitation was awful, and the country was embroiled in a war on the other side of the globe. Tension between the government and the masses was growing, and it was only a matter of time before something happened. On the 9th of January, 1905, 20,000 workers carrying crucifixes and portraits of the Tsar, led by Father Gapon, marched towards the Winter Palace to speak with the Tsar. They wanted to present to him a petition asking for reform, an 8-hour workday, and protection against their bosses. Obviously, the crucifixes and the portraits that they were wielding were incredibly intimidating, so the soldiers guarding the palace opened fire, killing and injuring dozens in an event known as Bloody Sunday. So, 1905 has come off to a very terrible start. To follow up the massacre, workers all over the country went on strike, and peasants started seizing land from the rural nobility. As you can expect, the armed forces proved essential in combating civil unrest, but they weren't entirely reliable to do so. The soldiers of the armed forces had their own issues to deal with. One of them was their officers. You see, Russian officers had a very severe case of being massive cunts. Discipline in the Russian army was very strict and brutal, with officers often beating their men for the slightest screw-ups and, in some cases, even having them executed. During the 1905 revolution, various socialist organizations attempted to make contact with sailors from the Black Sea Fleet to stage a general uprising. However, the crew of one of the ships revolted before this could happen, spoiling these plans. The battleship Potemkin had only entered service in 1903 with a crew of 800 and was one of the most modern in the Russian Navy. By 1905, she was stationed off the coast of Sevastopol, waiting for supplies before taking part in some exercises. On the 14th of June, 1905, one of the sailors noticed that there were maggots feasting on the meat that was supposed to be put in their soup. Upon hearing this, Captain Gilikov notified the ship's doctor, who was soon called down to inspect the contents. Surprisingly, he came to the bright conclusion that they were not in fact maggots. Instead, he claimed, they were just fly eggs, and that the meat was perfectly fit to eat. Even if true, that is still disgusting. The meat was used at night to prepare soup for the sailors, but they, for reasons I'm sure are obvious, didn't want to eat it. The sailors then sent a deputation led by Grigory Valenchuk, who was a member of the ship's Social Democratic Organization. Upon meeting with Captain Gilikov, Valenchuk got into a confrontation with his executive officer, Commander Gilyarovsky. Apparently, Valenchuk spoke to Gilyarovsky with such a plain language that the officer burst out in a fit of rage and shot him on spot. The officers even tried to execute several of the rebellious soldiers, but they were not so successful. Gilyarovsky was then jumped by the men. He was either killed immediately or was thrown overboard and shot in the water. The rest of the officers were rounded up by the sailors, who were at this point in full rebellion. 12 of the officers were captured and locked up below deck. A few of them, including Captain Gilikov, were killed and then thrown overboard. A small number of them even jumped ship voluntarily and tried swimming back to Sevastopol. With the ship under control, the sailors formed a People's Committee and elected a sailor named Matyushenko as its chairman. The men hoisted the red banner and set course for the port of Odessa, which had been in the middle of a worker strike for the past 2 weeks. The Potemkin arrived on the 15th of June. The sailors were greeted with enthusiasm by the protesting workers and sent parties ashore to purchase provisions, bury Vakulenchuk, appeal to the local population, release officers who didn't support them, and contact socialist parties. The first group sent ashore carried with them the body of Vakulenchuk and took him to the Odessa steps that connected the city to the harbor. They pinned a piece of paper to his chest, stating the following: "This is the body of Vakulenchuk, killed by the commander for having told the truth. Retribution has been meted out to the commander." A crowd soon gathered around the sailors, listening to speeches, singing revolutionary songs, and downing an ungodly amount of vodka because of course they fucking did. As the day ended, things became more violent. Mobs of people began to loot and burn the nearby warehouses, and around 9:30 p.m., loyalist troops began occupying strategic posts around the city in preparation to fight against the mutineers. Prior to the confrontations, the sailors tried to appeal to the soldiers. "The sailors of the Potemkin appeal to you, soldiers and Cossacks, to put down your weapons and let us win freedom for the people. We request the peaceful citizens of Odessa to leave the town, because in case of any violence being attempted against us, we will reduce Odessa to a heap of ruins." This achieved nothing. The soldiers soon began to shoot at anyone in the harbor. All the while, the sailors of the Potemkin did nothing. In their defense, I don't think they really could have. Many people ran away, and some even jumped into the water in hopes of escaping, with many of them drowning. In total, between 2,000 were killed and another 3,000 were wounded. If you're wondering, they didn't kill anyone on the Odessa steppes. It's just some artistic liberty taken in Einstein's film. On June 16th, the day after the massacre, Vakulinchuk was finally given a proper funeral, even though it did devolve into an ugly political confrontation. However, the sailors of the Potemkin failed to convince the authorities to give them amnesty. Not having much else to do, the Potemkin began to shell Odessa with its 6-inch guns. The crew of the Potemkin had hoped to provoke a larger rebellion in the Black Sea Fleet, but there were only a few minor disturbances that were easily put down. The most notable of them occurred on June 17th on the battleship Georgy Pobedonosets. On the 18th, the Potemkin set sail to the Romanian port of Constanța, hoping to receive some support. But on their way, they encountered a fleet of 11 loyalist ships in a tense standoff. However, none of them opened fire as the admirals feared that their own sailors may defect. The Russian Navy sent a torpedo boat after them in the direction of Constanța to attack the rebel ship, but was unable to find it. The bulk of the Navy was hanging around Sevastopol with their thumbs up their asses, not really doing anything. Tsar Nicholas even wrote in his diary the following day, "Let us hope for God's sake that this difficult and shameful story is over." Once in Constanța, the Potemkin asked the Romanians for fuel and other supplies, but were refused. Not having much of a choice, the Potemkin set out to sea once again, this time en route to the port of Fedosia in Crimea, but they too refused to help them, and once again they headed towards Constanța, this time surrendering to the Romanian authorities. The Potemkin was later handed over to the Russians, who renamed the ship the Panteleimon, but to their frustration, the crew was given asylum in Romania, or they just ended up moving somewhere else. For some fucking reason, many of them even went back to Russia, and were promptly tried by the authorities, either being imprisoned, exiled to Siberia, or shot. Matyushenko himself returned to Russia in 1907, eventually being hanged. After the mutiny, the Panteleimon went on to have a not-so-great career. In 1907, she accidentally sank a Russian submarine. During World War I, she saw limited action, mostly against the Ottomans in the early years of the war. By 1916, she was demoted since she was now considered obsolete. In 1918, she was captured by the Germans and kept in Sevastopol. After the war, she was handed over to the British, who then destroyed her engines to prevent her from being captured by the Red Army. Finally, in 1923, the Bolsheviks decided that she was completely useless and scrapped her for parts. The remainder of her initial crew eventually made their way back to Russia after the February Revolution, probably going on to regret that very decision. In 1905, the story of the Potemkin Mutiny was immortalized by Sergei Einstein in his film Battleship Potemkin. Fun fact, it was later banned in the USSR by Joseph Stalin. I guess he just didn't like the movie. Cringe. How fucking cringe. And that's it. What? Were you expecting some sort of fancy outro?
Una cabro, chúpame el pene.